All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going deep on a topic I know a lot of you are curious about. The US-Canada trade situation back in 2018. We've got some fascinating excerpts from an article that was published right as things were getting really interesting, so we're going to break it all down for you. You know how sometimes you go to buy something, like lumber, from the hardware store, and suddenly the price is way higher than you remember?
Yeah, I've been there.
Well, that's the kind of impact we're talking about with these trade wars.
It's crazy how intertwined the U.S. and Canadian economies really are. This whole thing was high stakes, for sure. And we're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet here. It's real people's jobs and businesses, and even the stuff we use every single day.
Okay, so picture this. It's 2018, President Trump's in the White House, and his approach to trade is, well, let's just say he likes to shake things up.
Right.
Tariffs are kind of his go-to move. And this time, Canada's in the crosshairs.
The article really lays out the drama, focusing on Trump's decision to impose a 25% tariff on a whole bunch of Canadian goods. And just to add fuel to the fire, he tacks on another 10% on energy.
Wow.
This is way beyond just some dry policy debate. It's hitting things like the lumber for our homes, the steel that goes into our cars, even that morning cup of coffee.
Yeah, those are the things people actually notice and feel in their wallets.
Exactly.
The article actually quotes Candace Lang, who was the president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce at the time. She didn't hold back, calling the decision nonsensical and pointing out that most Americans didn't even support these tariffs.
That's an important point. It makes you wonder who was actually supposed to benefit from these tariffs. Was it a political move to appeal to a certain group of voters, or was there some kind of larger economic strategy at play?
Well, the article does mention Trump linking these tariffs to concerns about illegal border crossings and drug trafficking. But it also says a lot of people were skeptical about that explanation, especially since boosting border security didn't seem to change his mind about the tariffs at all.
It's like, I don't know, it's like saying you're locking your front door but then building a wall around your entire property.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
It's a bit of a head scratcher, for sure. And of course, Canada wasn't just going to sit back and take it. The article mentions that they had their own set of retaliatory tariffs, all prepped and ready to fire back. But even within Canada, there were different opinions on how best to respond to all this.
Oh, absolutely. Think about provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, whose economies are massively dependent on things like oil and potash exports. They were understandably nervous about any actions that could hurt those industries even more. After all, the article highlights that the U.S. was importing almost 4.6 million barrels of oil from Canada every single day. Can you even imagine that much oil? We're talking enough to fill something like 1,500 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
Whoa, that's a mind-boggling amount.
Yeah.
It really puts into perspective just how deeply connected the U.S. and Canadian energy sectors are. And this kind of interdependence just adds another layer of complexity to the whole trade war situation, with potential consequences that reach way beyond just dollars and cents.
And let's not forget about all the small businesses that get caught in the middle of these disputes.
Yeah.
The Canadian Federation of Independent Business was pretty vocal about this, pointing out that these tariffs would disproportionately impact smaller businesses because so many of them rely on that cross-border trade. Imagine you're a small craft brewery in Canada that ships its beer to distributors down in the US. Suddenly, your costs skyrocket because of these tariffs, and you're left wondering if you can even keep your doors open.
It really makes you think about the human cost of all these political decisions. We often get caught up in the statistics and the policy debates, but it's easy to forget that there are real people whose lives and businesses are being directly affected by what's happening in Washington.
It's a reminder that economics isn't just about numbers, it's about people. Now, one of the key questions the article raises is, were these tariffs intended to actually damage the Canadian economy, or were they part of a bigger plan? Remember, this is all happening while NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is being renegotiated.
Ah, yes. The NAFTA renegotiations, which ultimately led to the USMCA. The article hints that these tariffs might have been a strategic move by the Trump administration, a way to gain leverage in those negotiations. It's kind of like going into a negotiation with a stack of chips, even if you don't actually plan on playing all of them.
That's a great analogy. It does make you wonder, especially since the article reminds us that Trump had also threatened a 25% tariff on Canadian-made cars, although he didn't actually go through with it on that one. Still, even the threat itself can make businesses hesitant to invest or expand.
Absolutely. It creates this uncertainty that hangs over everything. The article specifically mentions this, talking about the chilling effect this kind of uncertainty can have on investment and economic growth. It reminds me of what happened earlier that year with the steel and aluminum tariff.
Oh, yeah, this caused a lot of chaos.
For sure. And while Canada and Mexico did eventually get exemptions from those tariffs, that initial shock really sent ripples through the market.
Right.
Delays, disruptions, you name it. So the question becomes, were these tariffs on Canadian goods another attempt at that kind of strong-arm tactic, or was something else going on?
That's the million-dollar question. And to figure out the answer, we need to look at what happened next. So we left off with Canada trying to smooth things over, holding meetings with Republicans in Washington, and even presenting their border security plan to address some of Trump's concerns. But,
Yeah, it seemed like even a border security plan worth $1.3 billion wasn't going to cut it.
wow.
The article quotes Trump directly saying, nothing's going to stop those tariffs. Not for Canada, not for Mexico, not for China.
Wow, so he was pretty set on his approach. But then there's this interesting bit where the article mentions Scott Bessent, Trump's Treasury Secretary at the time, and he sort of hints that tariffs weren't just a simple on-off switch for the administration.
Right. He kind of laid out these three main ways they saw tariffs being used. One, to deal with unfair trade practices. Two, to bring in some cash for the government. And then three, and this is the one that really jumps out here, as a tool for negotiating. So while the border security thing was the reason given, it seems like there might have been a bigger strategy at play.
Okay, so if we're looking at these tariffs as a bargaining chip, that changes things a bit. It suggests that maybe the goal wasn't to destroy the Canadian economy, but more to gain an advantage in the NAFTA renegotiations.
Exactly. Experts quoted in the article saw it as a way to pressure Canada and Mexico during those talks. It's like saying, hey, we're serious about getting a deal that works for us, and we're not afraid to use tariffs to get there.
It's a risky move, though. I mean, sure, it gives you leverage, but it also has the potential to damage the long-term relationship between the countries.
Oh, sure.
And don't forget the disruption it causes to businesses and all those supply chains that cross the border.
Absolutely. The article captures that concern, quoting business leaders who were worried about the lasting damage to both the U.S. and Canadian economies. They're so closely linked, And it's not just about those big corporations either. All that disruption trickles down to everyday workers and families whose jobs depend on those industries.
It's a good reminder that when we talk about economics, we're really talking about people. Now, the article brings up this other interesting point. Trump seemed to believe that the government should use tariffs to generate more revenue. A lot of economists would probably push back on that, warning about the risk of inflation.
Yeah, it's that classic debate between protectionism and free trade. Protectionists argue that tariffs are necessary to protect domestic industries and jobs, while free trade advocates say, hey, open markets lead to lower prices, more choices for consumers, and ultimately, better economic growth.
And in this case, it seems like President Trump was definitely leaning towards that protectionist side, using tariffs as a tool to create and achieve his goals, both economic and political. Now remember, we're not here to say which approach is right or wrong. This is about understanding all sides of the issue.
Exactly.
And one thing that's clear from the article is that these tariffs on Canada weren't just some random event. It connects back to those steel and aluminum tariffs from earlier in the year, which we talked about before. Even though Canada and Mexico eventually got exemptions, they created a ton of uncertainty.
Definitely. And that uncertainty is a key takeaway here. Even if tariffs are eventually removed or exemptions are granted, the damage might already be done. Businesses hesitate to invest, supply chains get disrupted, and overall consumer confidence takes a hit.
It's like a ripple effect, The initial impact spreads outward, affecting different parts of the economy, and it can even spill over into those political relationships.
Yeah, it's like that butterfly effect. One small change can have huge consequences somewhere else.
Exactly. It highlights just how connected everything is in the global economy. It brings us back to that question we were talking about earlier. Were these tariffs just a blunt instrument? Or was there a more calculated strategy behind them?
Right.
The article seems to lean towards the latter, suggesting that they were a tactic in the NAFTA renegotiations aimed at securing a better deal for the U.S.
It's a fascinating theory. So where did this all lead? Did those tactics actually work? Well, that's the story for our next and final part.
Okay, so we're back. We've been digging into this whole trade war thing between the U.S. and Canada in 2018. The tariffs, the retaliation, the politics behind it all. What happened in the end?
That's what everyone wanted to know, right? Now, this article we've been looking at, it came out right in the middle of everything, so it doesn't show us the whole picture. But it does give us some clues about what could happen down the road.
Yeah, like that feeling of, oh no, not this again.
Exactly.
First, the steel and aluminum tariffs, then those threats about the auto industry. It created so much tension and uncertainty. How did businesses even deal with all that back and forth?
Well, the article points out that just the threat of tariffs can be enough to make businesses think twice about investing. Companies get nervous about starting big projects, expansion plans get put on hold, the whole economy gets a little more careful. Imagine you're a furniture manufacturer in Canada, and you're thinking, okay, maybe we should expand the factory. But then there's this threat of a 25% tariff on everything you send to the U.S., so you might just decide to wait and see what happens.
Right, it's too risky.
Exactly.
And that hesitation, that can have a domino effect impacting businesses, consumers, even workers. It's like this chain reaction where one little trade barrier can set off a whole bunch of economic consequences. So that furniture manufacturer, maybe they postpone their expansion. That means they're not hiring new workers. They're not buying as much lumber and supplies. And that slowdown, it hits other businesses too.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to understand these trade wars. It's not just some abstract economic theory. We're talking about real impacts on people's lives.
So true. So let's zoom out for a second and think bigger picture. The article suggests that these tariffs might have been part of the NAFTA renegotiations, which ended up becoming the USMCA. Did that strategy work? Was it all worth it in the end?
It's a tough question. And honestly, even historians are still debating the effects of Trump's trade policies. But we do know that the USMCA did replace NAFTA.
And this new agreement, did it fix those problems that started the trade war? Did it make things better between the U.S. and Canada?
Well, the USMCA did change some things, like in digital trade and labor regulations. But did it fundamentally change the whole relationship? That's up for debate. Some people say it was just a small update to NAFTA, while others see it as a bigger shift.
It makes sense. Trade agreements are never a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
They're constantly evolving, adapting to all the new stuff that pops up in the world. And who knows what the future holds for the U.S. and Canada when it comes to trade.
That's what makes a deep dive like this so interesting. It brings up more questions than answers. It makes you think critically and really see how complex global trade really is.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we hope you'll do. Don't just take our word for it. Go out there and explore. Do your own research. Think about what it all means. This is something that affects all of us.
Here's something to think about. Given how connected our economies are, could all this back and forth with tariffs be a sign of something bigger? Like, are we moving away from free trade and towards a more protectionist world?
That's a great question. It's definitely something to keep an eye on. Well, we've only just scratched the surface here, but I hope this deep dive has given you a good starting point for your own exploration.
Remember, knowledge is power. So take what you've learned today, use it to have those important conversations, challenge the way we think about things, maybe even spark some positive change.
That's what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and until next time, keep diving deep into the things that